Professor of Measurement, Evaluation and Research Methodology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Professor Zumbo has worked on numerous subjects related to methodology, psychometrics, statistics, and applied to various fields such as language testing, health sciences, or again, well-being, for example. His scholarly life is said to be driven by an immense curiosity and desire to learn. It is no doubt the reason why his views are often of an epistemological nature, which allows us to take a step back on our activity on educational assessment. Within our conference theme on social justice and assessment, he will talk to us this morning about rich notion of consequences, side effects, and ecology of testing. So please join me to welcome Bruno Zumbo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you in particular also to Joanne Baird. I don't see her in the audience quite yet. Joanne, wherever you are, thank you so much. She approached me initially to a really kind invitation, actually, to come today and address you and engage with you in a conversation in this absolutely lovely venue in this stunning city. Friday afternoon, I got on a plane in Vancouver, Canada. That's the far western side of Canada. Flew across the globe to Amsterdam, missed the fog by some luck, and then made it over to Norwich for a few days for a conference, and then yesterday here, and it's just an absolutely stunning adventure. Today I'm going to be, as Terry mentioned, most of my work is often very technical and mathematical. That's not the work today, so don't pack up your bags and leave quite yet. The work today is really a long-standing bit of work of mine that's more sort of conceptual, foundational, if you wish. I don't like much the word foundational, but that's the kind of area we're going into today. And I only want to link up, as the slide gives you, a sense of opening slide here, consequences, side effects, and what we're calling the ecology of testing. And I really want to introduce a couple of ideas, particularly the notion that these are key considerations and key in considering assessment in vivo. So let's see if we can get a change in slide now. No? How about there? There we go. So it's an overview. This is an overview of my program of research. It draws heavily upon a series of papers with some colleagues of mine. Anita Hubley in particular would feature prominently in this work. I've done a lot of work with her in this area. Brian Maddox, who I think is somewhere in the audience, and I have been doing some work, rely a bit on some of the ideas of Brian and I, and Brenda Tay-Lim and others. And the whole idea here is to bring this work together, and I wanted it to give a sense, to not just get a sense of what I've been trying to say and get an opportunity to reflect upon it, but also to see what sort of interesting, provocative ideas can stem from it. It's lovely to look at one's work sometimes and sort of see it come together almost as the elements of a narrative and see how it comes together. So that's kind of what my goal is today. I also am hoping to draw you out into conversation and discussion. So purposefully, I've tried to time it today so we have a fair amount of opportunity at the end to chat. If not, I'll be in the hallway. And you'd be amazed the kind of conversation we can have over a glass of red wine in the bar as well. So first one's on me. How does that sound? So I'm hoping to engage you in some way. Don't leave yet for the bar. We can have a few minutes first. So I want to give you an overview of a framework for test validation that invites a study of the matter of consequences, social and otherwise, and testing and assessment. I want to say a few words about what my colleagues and I in a recent paper in the journal Language Assessment Quarterly refer to as the ecology of items, scale, or test responding. And I want to show how the ecology of testing points to an in vivo view of testing and assessment rather than the more widely received in vitro view. And I want to introduce a notion that I've seen very little discussion of. I'd be very curious to hear if you've seen it in this language in this way, the notion of off-label use of tests. And I'm going to try and bring these all together. As foreshadowing, please note that these three interconnected ideas influence each other, and invite each other into the theorizing and praxis. A focus on consequences and test validity, the ecology, and the off-label use of tests and the need for ecological findings. All of these sort of come together, I'm hoping to show in an interesting way. Ultimately, measures, tests, assessments, and evaluation are used or have implications for ranking, intervention, feedback, decision-making, or policy purposes. Explicit recognition of this fact brings the often ignored and sometimes maligned concepts of consequences, as well as the ecology of testing, to the front. Consequences, as Louise earlier even mentioned in passing in her presentation, consequences, in fact, have been an idea that goes back quite a ways. Some debate as to when you'll see the earliest conversations of it. Certainly Messick, Crombach, and others who are significant going back several decades into this. So they've been around, and they kind of come into the fore and into the back and into the fore, and what idea is to draw them out in an important way. Given that measures have personal and social consequences and impact, it becomes important to evaluate the intended consequences, the unintended side effects of measurement, a term that we've been trying to introduce, when validating the inferences and uses from tests. Now, we're talking about bringing this in when you're validating. Nearly everyone in the room will agree that consequences are important. Somewhere where it becomes complicated is where you put it. And I follow very much in line with individuals like Sam Messick, where you put the consequences in the validity conversation. Furthermore, one is pressed to consider assessment as something in vivo rather than in vitro. And for those of you who remembered studying biology, at some point in time, if my friends who are virologists talk about viruses in vitro, meaning under glass in a controlled environment, and that virus is in fact quite different than a virus in vivo. So when the flu virus begins to float around, we think about it as in vitro, studied in a laboratory, or in a controlled setting, as opposed to in vivo, in the living organism. And I want to foreshadow for you now that in many situations, those viruses are quite different in vivo than they are in vitro. And that becomes important. All right, let's see. There we go. So doing so necessitates an ecological model of item responding and test performance. It's important but subtle to recognize that our aim is to provide a richer sense of what my colleagues and I in 2015 call the ecology of the testing situation. There's an actually lovely paper that's coming out, if it's not out already, by Brian Maddox, where in Assessment and Education, in which he draws some of this out from an anthropologic point of view. He and I and some colleagues, it's just appeared in the International Journal of Testing, where we actually introduce a very interesting idea of psychometric ethnography, or if you wish, depending on your proclivities, ethnographic psychometrics. And so I think it's important. Again, there's been wonderful work by McNamara and Rover, some work by Jana Fox, and some of the earlier work of mine from a few years ago. As I argue in 2007, psychometric investigation of the testing situation is necessary to identify sources of the differences in item performance. I frame these comments in terms of differential item function or item bias, but the claim is more general. By adding testing situation to the possible reasons for differential item functioning or item bias, one greatly expands the praxis and theorizing beyond test structure and hence beyond multidimensionality itself. So I'm trying to subtly draw us out into this. A quotation of mine that I will often use is that the mere act of measuring or testing engenders consequences. So for those in the business, some of you in the room who think consequences are not relevant, my counter is that the mere act of measuring or testing engenders it. Anita Hubley and I show that the naming of a test or subtests reflects our values, of course, and may influence how we think about or make use of the construct, and we actually argue that it shapes the construct. So we take the labeling issue just one step further and weave it into conversations of test validity. And of course, consequences are very relevant for theory building, future research, individual decision making, perceptions of the use of tests in research. And again, this all necessitates an ecological model of item responding and test performance. So therefore, in summary, there's 3 interesting ideas that have emerged from this line. Testing and assessment validation framework that brings consequences to the foreground, an ecological model of item scale test responding along with the new statistical method and methods to support this work, and this on and off-label use of tests and their connection to consequences and ecology. Recently, Eric Chen and I published a book in 2014, an edited book, in which we presented a systematic review of validation practices as a study of the scholarly genre of validation reports, its focus, style, orientation, and structure, and how this genre frames validity theory and practices across many disciplines and international jurisdictions. This is a book that came out by Sage Press in 2014, and these were done by, I think it was a series of 15 reviews, journals, disciplines around measures, everywhere from medical education to educational psychology to health psychology to psychology to a little bit of work in the area of focusing on journals. For example, Ben Shear and I did a review of practices in the journal Educational and Psychological Measurement, contrasting the 1950s and 60s to what's going on today. One of our starkest findings was that the study of consequences is consistently underrepresented in validation practices. We're not the first to say this, Greg Cizik and others. The difference is our conclusion from that. Cizik, I think Greg would probably, or has said, that this reflects the fact that consequences really are not part of the validation practice and validity theory, and that practitioners put them where they should be, which is somewhere else, but not in validation. I would argue quite the contrary. I would argue quite the contrary. Based on our work, what was also kind of stunning out of it all is that I think in the entire volume, it was somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 7,000 articles were reviewed. And the most constant and consistent finding, and in fact it's pretty much the same finding from the 1960s to the mid-2000s, was that validation primarily involved something about dimensionality analysis, factor analysis, if you wish, and a little bit about correlation with other variables. And it was quite fascinating when you see that, and it also came across as it was sort of like automatons. Recently I described it as there's this notion of stamp, the gathering and collating of stamps. Well, actually, this is even less interesting than that. The way it is because at least in stamp collections, there's themes and patterns and histories. Oftentimes, these are just rather, the practices in the journals are really quite sort of ad hoc-ish, is the feeling that they have, opportunistic. And what's interesting, now, first thing to keep in mind is that we focused on scholarly journals, which is actually not a bad way to look at the genre of validation practices, which means we weren't really talking about contemporary practices at testing companies or even really in test batteries. And part of what prevented us is that for the most part, although there are exceptions, for the most part, validation practices and validation studies are in fact considered propriety at many testing organizations, so it's really hard to get our hands on it. That is changing, and there are organizations that have systematic validation plans. But I have to be frank with you, it's still not being reported in a very integrated way. There are exceptions. So one of the things that this sort of more expanded evidential basis includes is we want to talk about our influence in terms of the context and the ecological model, as well as the real desire for mixed and what goes by the name of qualitative inquiry, although my colleagues are reminding me that that term is passé. I hear everything from narrative to other terms. But I think you know what I mean when I say that. Rather than just factor analysis. Oh, and I might add the factor analysis, what it's really become is just fancier, right? Now you're doing likelihood theory, you're not just doing things via component analysis, you're testing models, you're doing this thing called exploratory SEM, you're bringing into the scaling of the variables. We're doing more elegant things, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing, fancier, cooler, sexier, at least to psychometricians. But beyond that, it really isn't much more. 2 or 3 of you smiled because you know what I meant, which is also a sad reflection on you. We want to begin by reminding people that we take a position similar to Sam Messick in this case, that it's important to note that not all social consequences are due to sources of invalidity. For example, if a negative social consequence such as financially penalizing schools for children's poor test performance, if that is the result of test misuse due to external political forces, to me, the 2001 No Child Left Behind is possibly the best example in the United States of such. Such consequences outside of the realm of validity, the reason is that it's actually, it's a misuse, and misuse by its own definition, as Messick argues, moves us away from the construct, and so we're no longer talking about test validity in that context. That's actually misuse, a problem, but not actually about validation. So we focus on social consequences that are due to sources of invalidity. Therefore, understanding sources of item scale test variability is very important. But it's really about appropriate test use, not just any test use. Anita Hubley and I, in a paper in 2011 and in a chapter in the APA, American Psychological Association handbook on testing psychometrics, we presented a framework for test validation that expands on the concept of consequences and brings it forward. I provided here briefly for you just to help you visualize some important psychometric elements and where consequences, and a term we've introduced of side effects, appear. It's a very busy looking slide, but I'll talk you through it very quickly. We have figure 1, which I think appears on your left-hand side. And we see from there, we have theories, psychometric models, and you'll see values going through all of it. So the sort of our philosophic point of view, the way we approach the epistemologic and ontological questions, is we start saying, of course, values are essential to this. Not a new idea. Others have said this, others have poo-pooed it, others have embraced it in the field, but we put it up front. Values, of course, are there. Values influence our theories, and by theories, we don't just we just don't mean theories of the phenomena or construct, but also about the theories of measurement. Theories of measurement. Unbeknownst to some of my friends in the world, there is more than one view of what is measurement. And I don't mean IRT, the various brands of IRT, Roche, non-Roche, all these other things. I actually mean theories of measurement. There actually are other approaches to measurement that we seldom, if ever, see in the field. There's value statements, there's comments in there. That drives what we're doing. We can then see very quickly all of this construct theory. We begin to see the construct leading to test development, item development, test validation in here, and explanation, and then that unpacks over there. We see score use, and we see consequences and side effects here. What I want you to realize is that you see consequences and side effects here, then when you follow that box over, you see unintended social and personal side effects there. This is done to highlight that these consequences and side effects occur naturally as a result of reporting using scores, but also have an impact on score meaning and validity. And for me, a position I've been putting forward for about 15 years now is that validity is explanation focused. In fact, my work is sort of a contemporary twist on Cronbach and Meehl, who quite appropriately were reflecting the philosophical positions in 1955, and sort of a logical empiricism of some brand. Today, I follow more of a sort of a Bas van Fraassen sort of view of philosophy of science, American Dutch philosopher of science, probably the last grand theorist that we have. And yes, there have been other grand theorists beyond Popper, or actually there have been other theorists beyond Popper. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because many stop at Popper. There's been a lot more work in philosophy of science since Popper, just in case you're wondering. And Bas van Fraassen does a very nice job of unpacking some of these. I don't embrace all of it, but I'm influenced heavily by van Fraassen's ideas. But in here, I talk about explanation. And so, like Cronbach and Meehl, and in fact, like other theorists recently, my friend Denis Boersboom, who has a particular view of it as well, he has a particular view of explanation, which is very sort of causal based. Mine, you will see in a moment, is more pragmatic, and pragmatic and also ecologically and contextually driven. But so when you look at validation and explanation, it unpacks here. You see different kinds of evidence. You see a lot of the typical kinds of evidence that have emerged. You see intended social and personal consequences and intended and social personal, unintended social and personal side effects, all of which connect to score meaning. And I'm glad if someone wants to chat with me a little bit about that as we move on. In this framework, it's important to note that the arrows from the various forms of evidence, intended social and personal consequences, intended social and personal side effects, those are different things, and they all are connected to score meaning and inference, and it's all bidirectional. The whole system is. Like Messick, we don't view test misuse, as I said a few moments ago, as an aspect of social consequences in the context of validation. Test misuse is important, but it's irrelevant to discussions of score meaning in this outside of construct validity and validation process, at least for us. Instead, it's focusing on the context of test use, consequences of legitimate test use that may influence test score meaning and inference, and what makes consequences relevant to the validation process. Explicit considerations of social and personal consequences and side effects might enlighten us with respect to whether personal notions like age, gender, culture, and contextual factors, learning, environment, social support, gender socialization, gender stereotype threat, are part of the construct of interest or external to it, and that requires some important thinking and reflection. At this point in my presentation, many people in the audience begin to think, wow, I wonder what statistical technique is developed to do this. I haven't. We get to do the good old-fashioned thinking and documenting and tracing out our reasoning. That's also validity evidence. So just because you can't put a p-value next to it doesn't mean it's not evidence. All right? All right. So the Hubley-Zumbo expanded view of validation invites a focus on ecology and in vivo frameworks. And this is very hard for you to see, I'm sure, but you can see here, and this actually is a figure from the 2015 article, you can see that in here is either item, test, or scale performance, and you see boxes in here in this sort of layers going out. You can see cognitive and psychological variables, the construct, you can see personal variables, age, gender. You can see out here things like community, neighborhood, state, nation, family, ecology. You can see teachers, classrooms, etc. What we're trying to say here, and as you'll see that we're borrowing a particular line of thinking, testing is in vivo, it's not in vitro. For the most part, the psychometric models in particular, the psychometric models, and hence validation practices, and hence views of assessment have really been focused on an in vitro view, a test tube view of the test score. An ecology of item responding includes test format, item content, psychometric dimensionality, personal characteristics, and typical individual different variables such as cognition, teacher classroom, school context, family, ecology, and characteristics. Some of you in the room will be absolutely mortified. Bruno, how can we possibly consider any or all of these together in our psychometric models? Hang on, here we go. Actually, I think I'll push on a little bit. You can actually see and point it out. Actually, in that 2015 paper, we actually were looking at some international reading data, and we actually looked at how we had this very complicated, moderated forms of item difference in item performance, or diff as we call it in the business. How it's this very moderated idea influenced by these various kinds of variables. Our work is clearly influenced by ecological systems theory. You're in Bronfenbrenner, 79, and others. Clearly, we're being influenced a lot by that. I am. There could be more layers, and these layers could include latent variables and a mixture type of statistical model. And they could, at least in theory, interact and result in mediated or moderated effects. It's really useful around diff, but it's actually more generally useful around it. The ecological situated point of view is tied closely with the notion of in vivo. Now, please here, there's a rhetorical move from how the environment affects the person to a type of interactivism in which the test taker is situated within these enabling conditions and highlights processes and forms of inferences of the context or situation, sometimes referred to as the environment or the ecology, on the test taker, and that are obscure or entirely absent from the received standard view of item and test responding. They're either obscured or they're entirely absent. But it's an important rhetorical move. It's not how the environment affects the person. In fact, instead we're looking at these enabling conditions, and a very, very interesting sort of rhetorical shift that happens here. The received psychometric models cast the latent variable as explanatory, as do we, but we differ in what we mean by explanation. The received view is sort of an almost an idealized manipulation type view of causal explanations, where you have these confounders being eliminated by some type of matching or integration out of the equations. The view that we're trying to put here is our ecological situated approach is focused on multi-layered ecological variables as explanatory with a Bronfenbrenner lens. So we're getting close to the end here of my slide deck. I hope I've intrigued you enough. The next shift is, given our thinking about consequences, ecology, and in vivo, let's now turn to the matter of off-label use of tests. And I don't have a lot to say here because it's a relatively new idea that I'm still playing with. So what is off-label use of a test or assessment? Well, off-label use is the use of a test or assessment for an unapproved purpose, or for an undocumented or unapproved intended target test group, such as an age group or cultural group. Off-label use may also include test administration in an unapproved or undocumented manner. And again, I'm borrowing now from a sort of a soft pharmacological kind of model here, where you have on-label and off-label uses of a product, in this case a test. I generally, of course, like most, would caution against off-label use, but there's some subtlety here. There's not a great deal of discussion of off-label use of tests, partly because, well, how do I say this? Most tests really don't tell us what the on-label use is. So it's really hard to look at off-label if you don't even know what on-label is, right? And there is a reason for a lot of that. Some tests are better than others. Even if they tell you how you might use it, I've never seen a test that says don't use it for this other thing. So I've never seen data that's been released that says, please do not rank countries and go into chaos and change your educational system based on our test scores. I'm not suggesting that that organization should be doing that, just to be very clear. At least I'm not saying that today, maybe when I'm in Italy next week with a few glasses of wine in Florence. But certainly, we don't say to people, don't do it for this. We don't say, don't use this test on immigrants who don't speak the language. We don't say that. We'll say, well, you can do things with it. The why? Well, in my most cynical moments, it has to do with market and brand and such. But the reality is, I think a lot of organizations and test developers and data sharers and providers, provokers, if you wish, just don't want to narrow it down, partly because they're not sure. So it's hard to tell off-label if we don't know what in the world is on-label. But I still think it goes on quite a bit, and it's also very difficult to police. There's a friend of mine who's a sociolinguist who's been trying to get me to read some interesting ideas in sociolinguists around understood use or understood meaning of something. And so he says, well, maybe these tests don't have it written down, but Bruno, there's an understood use of the GRE. There's an understood use of the qualifications exams in the UK. I mean, there's understood uses even if they're not documented. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. However, the subtlety is this. And how am I doing for time? Am I okay? Ah, perfect. Test users may use a test off-label. Aha! Generally, I recommend it, but I say, well, a test user may use a test off-label. However, off-label use must better serve the student, or more generally the test taker, than other test alternatives, such as no test information or test that is already known to be inappropriate. And there are even situations in which bad data is a lot worse than some data at all. And I'm messing around with this idea. So I'm not sure I advise bad data. In fact, I think bad data is a bad thing. Yeah, yes, bad data is a bad thing. But at the same time, I'm trying to get a sense of this subtlety on when we might use something because there is no other alternative, and it appears to be what we have. However, if you're going to do this, and this is the twist that brings it around, you have a responsibility to provide the supporting evidence or experience to support the lack of unintended negative consequences and efficacy in construct interpretation. So if you're going to use something off-label, or if we're going to use something off-label, we then have an obligation to report notions of negative consequences, study them, bring together some supporting data or experience that we have for off-label use. When I talk to friends of mine who are physicians, particularly doing things like these sort of very exotic diseases, they'll use an off-label use, but they do go ahead and they document everything. It's incumbent upon them, and to provide a trail to support their decision. And in the end, this is the only alternative we had, which is a very different thing than, hey, isn't the test over there in the corner? Can't we use it? And let's not worry about it. It's a very different idea. Caution, that is described in the Hubley-Zumbo model. Off-label use may alter the construct, and or lead to intended social personal consequences, but also unintended social personal side effects as well. Much of the discussion against the inclusion of consequences for test validation and test misuse is around test misuse. And it concerns the feasibility. When some friends of mine talk about it, they say, Bruno, we find your presentations alarming because you always want us to do more. And we can't do it. We just simply cannot provide this. The burden is too large. And I sort of say, suck it up, buttercup. If you're, that's a French term, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. And I think that's no longer an acceptable excuse. It just isn't. I'm sorry. The fact that it's hard does not alarm me. The fact that it's expensive does not alarm me. Of course, I don't make money from tests, so I can say things like that. But it's true. It doesn't alarm me. I wish to push it further. And this notion of test misuse, that is a red herring. I mean, I can't believe we're still arguing this. I thought Messick got it straight. But it seems over and over it seems to resurface. We're just about done here. So the ecology of item responding, as Gelin and I say in 2005, allows the researcher to focus on sociological, structural, community, and contextual variables, as well as psychological and cognitive factors, as explanatory sources of item responding and test performance. And so I agree with authors who say tests impact outside variables, so the directionality. I'm turning the direction around and saying that these contextual variables impact the scores, right, in terms of validation. So it's not just the fact that tests have an impact that way. I'm saying these contextual community variables impact the test. Like Messick, we don't view test misuse as an aspect of social consequences. Certainly it's an important concern, but not one in terms of construct validation. Instead, it's the consequences of legitimate test use that may influence test score meaning and inference, and without which makes consequences relevant in the validation process. As you can see here, what we're trying to say in one of these last slides now is that to examine the values implicit in social and personal consequences and side effects stemming from legitimate test use and interpretation requires that test developers and test users must be willing to think deeply about validation. That's the part that's not troubling. The part that is troubling, and should be troubling, is one that many of my readers miss. Test developers and test users. Test developers and test users. So from a sort of a moral point of view, it's not enough to say, I'm not the developer. It's the developer's responsibility, and it's not enough for the developer to say it's the test user's responsibility. It's actually both's responsibility. Thank you very much. I'd like to engage in questions, and part of my funding comes from a subsidiary of the University of BC. So thank you very much. I hope we have an exciting conversation for the next little while.